Welcome to the Cyber Insider, Emsisoft's podcast all about cybersecurity. Your hosts today are Brett Callow, threat analyst here at Emsisoft, and I'm Luke Connolly, partner manager. We're delighted to have Andy Greenberg with us today. Andy is a senior writer for Wired, covering hacking, cybersecurity, and surveillance. He's also the author of books including Tracers in the Dark, The Global Hunt for the Crime Lords of Cryptocurrency, and Sandworm, A New Era of Cyberwar and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. Welcome, Andy, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Very glad to do it.
For those who haven't read it yet, can you tell us what Tracers is about?
Right. Well, Tracers in the Dark is really about not just the cryptocurrency crime, but this kind of like sea change in how we understand cryptocurrency. That, when Bitcoin first kind of came to prominence a decade and a half ago, we thought, I think that it was kind of conventional wisdom that this was untraceable currency, that it was a kind of, some sort of encrypted digital cash for the internet, and that it was going to offer all sorts of new possibilities for private, anonymous, untraceable transactions. And that this was almost like, digital cash that you could put into a briefcase and send across the network to anyone in the world without revealing your identity. And then it turned out that was pretty much the opposite of correct, that Bitcoin is incredibly traceable, and that, in fact, like this ability to trace cryptocurrency, what was once believed to be this kind of perfect crime coin, turned this world of cybercrime upside down. This is almost like a kind of honeypot that pulled in cyber criminals of every kind, as well as all sorts of people seeking financial privacy, and then essentially turned on the lights on this dark economy. And so the story is really about this one small group of detectives, first in the research world, and then in the tech industry. It's a lot of it is about the company Chainalysis, and then finally about law enforcement learning that this was possible and developing this kind of investigative superweapon of tracing cryptocurrency, and the incredible string of busts and takedowns, really some of the biggest cyber criminal takedowns in history that resulted from that discovery, if you could say it that way. Yeah.
Where did the idea for Tracers come from? What made you decide to write about this subject?
Well, I first wrote about Bitcoin in 2011. I pitched a story about it to my editors at Forbes magazine, where I worked at the time. I did try to buy about $40 worth of Bitcoin then, and Bitcoin was worth $1 in 2011. Unfortunately, my transaction didn't go through at Mt. Gox, the exchange, and I don't want to do the math about like how much that has cost me today in 2024, but I was interested in Bitcoin from the very beginning, but through this lens of being the kind of whatever perverted reporter who's always interested in the dark side of things and the criminal potentials of new technology. And I did think that Bitcoin offered like this new world of essentially monetizing the dark web, among other things. Like you could see this happening in 2011, that Bitcoin was being accepted on, dark web black markets like the Silk Road. And then it seemed to be working, that you could buy and sell and, really anything you wanted with this new cryptocurrency that seemed to promise to follow the money investigators. So I was initially interested in this really like the opposite story entirely, that I thought Bitcoin was going to, in fact, I even pitched a book on this at one point, about this entirely wrong idea that Bitcoin was going to be this kind of like new era where any kind of black market finance was now possible and untraceable. And it took me, really the better part of a decade to figure out just how wrong I was about this. But in 2020, I think it was, 2020, it was the middle of the pandemic. I started to really just notice, as I'm sure you two did too, that I think that Chainalysis, this cryptocurrency tracing company, was being credited publicly in law enforcement press releases announcing major criminal takedowns, one after another. And, I first thought like, I should reach out to Chainalysis. Like, this is an interesting counterintuitive story. People once thought that cryptocurrency was untraceable. It turns out that tracing it is turning out to be really instrumental in these investigations. And I met with one of the co-founders of Chainalysis, Jonathan Levin, and we had this like weird lunch outdoors in a like a COVID shed in Midtown Manhattan. And, he told me essentially like the whole story of the book. I have to give him credit for it. Like he told me like where this technology had come from. And then every investigation that Chainalysis had been a part of, starting really with the tracing of the Mt. Gox theft, this biggest ever heist of Bitcoins. 650,000 Bitcoins were stolen out of Mt. Gox in 2014. Chainalysis and its founder, Michael Groninger, another co-founder, were the ones who traced that money and tracked it down to show that it was stolen by certain Russian cyber criminals. They then went on to participate in the takedown of Alphabet, the biggest dark web market in history. And although Jonathan didn't tell me this initially, it turned out that they had developed a kind of secret tracing technique that allowed the Alphabet server to be discovered in Lithuania. That technique actually remains quite sensitive and secret even today. And I did my best to kind of expose it in the book, or rather it sort of leaked in a Chainalysis presentation around the time just before my book came out, which sort of took the onus off of me for revealing it. And then finally, Chainalysis had this enormous role in the takedown of Welcome to Video, one of the biggest, really, I think by some measures, the biggest child sexual abuse materials, what we used to call child porn, dark web markets. And that site was taken down through cryptocurrency tracing, and 337 men around the world were arrested and dozens of children were rescued as a result of this investigation that was really entirely made possible by the fact that the Bitcoin could be traced.
So again, people often assume that cryptocurrency is anonymous and untraceable, but as you've just explained, that's not the case at all. So how exactly does tracing work?
Yeah, I mean, when I explain it, it almost feels like a better question is, how, Andy, could you have been so dumb as to think that Bitcoin could ever be untraceable? Because, as I think people know today, every Bitcoin transaction is recorded in the blockchain. That is like how Bitcoin functions. Instead of a bank or any other authority kind of tracking every transaction in a big database, that database is public and it's copied out to thousands and thousands of computers around the world, and it cannot be changed, cannot be erased. That is, how Bitcoin works. It's underpinned by this immutable, permanent, distributed ledger called the blockchain. But that list of every transactions only shows that, a transaction goes from one long series of garbled characters, a Bitcoin address, to another long series of garbled characters, some other Bitcoin address. And so, even though I was aware of the blockchain, of course, like in 2011, when I first started writing about Bitcoin, I did think that, well, this is not truly anonymous. It's more pseudonymous. Like you can see a transaction go from one pseudonym to another. But if you can't figure out what somebody's Bitcoin address is, then you can't figure out whose pseudonym it is. Then you don't know whose money it is. And you can always spin up another Bitcoin address, another pseudonym anytime you want. So that makes it not truly untraceable, but at least, like you can always hide behind the mask of these Bitcoin addresses. And it was only really with for me, like the first big reveal of how wrong I was Sarah Mickeljohn's paper in 2014, known as, a fistful of Bitcoins, something like characterizing anonymous transactions between men with no names or something like that, characterizing transaction. So this was Sarah's big breakthrough moment where she started to point out ways in which you could start to sort of pierce this veil between people's identities and their Bitcoin addresses. And, I don't know how much I should get into like each of those techniques, but for instance, if you start to pull together money from several of your Bitcoin addresses into one at any point, or if you just spend Bitcoins from several addresses at the same time, you just revealed that you control all of those addresses. That's, that multi-input transaction just gave away that like each of those addresses is not a single pseudonym. They're all one person, one service, sometimes one dark web market. And that turned out to be alone incredibly powerful. I mean, it turned out that the Silk Road was this dark web market for all sorts of narcotics and, other contraband, was in many cases pooling together users' funds after they received them. And that meant that Sarah could create this huge cluster of the Silk Road's Bitcoin addresses. And she actually was able to demonstrate that she could see my transaction with the Silk Road. And I'll just say, for the purposes of not going into, not getting criminal charges, that was a test transaction. I did some drug deals with the Silk Road just to show for Forbes in 2013 or so that was possible. And she could see, because of her clustering of the Silk Road's addresses, every transaction that I'd done. And essentially, I'd done these drug deals in full public view. She also came up with some other really clever techniques. She could see that like there's this feature of some Bitcoin wallets that basically you can't spend just a fraction of the coins at an address. You actually have to kind of crack open the whole piggy bank, send all of the money, and then receive back your change at a new address. And if she can identify that change address, then she knows that change address also belongs to the sender, essentially. So tricks like that, allowed her actually to follow the money from from one address to the next, while still knowing that it all belonged to a certain identity. Sometimes that trail then hit the cryptocurrency exchange where you can send a subpoena. And these exchanges, are actually legally required if they do business with Americans or, people in the West to collect identifying information. And then they cough it up to law enforcement, and immediately all of your transactions are identified. So I think that is like, but Sarah actually didn't have that subpoena power. And she instead did kind of undercover transactions with a lot of these services to get samples of their addresses. And in doing so, was able to identify, a lot of what was going on in this, what seemed at the time to be like a really shady cryptocurrency economy. So that is like maybe her, like a really simple description of her bag of tricks that really changed the whole game.
Why did people ever believe that Bitcoin was untraceable? The mechanics of how it works have always been known. So how did we come to think that?
Yeah, well, like I said, it did seem at first like, there was no way to determine whose Bitcoin addresses somebody controlled. So, you could see every transaction. It was so tantalizing. You could see sometimes these massive amounts of money moving around, but it seemed could not figure out whose money it was. And it was really only with these slightly counterintuitive techniques that Sarah found, and then that were integrated into Chainalysis, and then ultimately used by law enforcement, that turned out, to be like entirely blown apart as a myth. And it turns out that it's actually, I think, better as the rule of thumb to just suggest that everything in the Bitcoin economy is essentially public. But it did require this cleverness. It also required a company, I think, ultimately, like Chainalysis, that does it at the kind of industrial scale. Sarah did these undercover transactions with like, a few dozen services. She did like some hundreds of these sneaky transactions to identify clusters. Chainalysis does this with absolutely everything on the blockchain, and they can tell you, they can really see, like, look at the blockchain as a map and tell you every single continent and, city and like who each of these little clusters is, down to specific ransomware affiliates and things like that. So that was, all necessary to unmask, to kind of pull away the mask from the blockchain. And it took some years to do it. Also, I guess the other thing is that even today, some people tell me, well, that's just because you're being sloppy. Like if you moved your coins through just one more hop or just one more mixing service, or, to be fair, through one privacy coin, you chain hop, you like move to another kind of cryptocurrency that's not as transparent as Bitcoin, that may be, like Zcash encrypts its entire blockchain, or like Monero tangles up its blockchain with this kind of mixed network, idea. Then it actually is just as untraceable as, you once thought it was, Andy. And there's something to that. Like it is possible, I think, if you are incredibly careful and, smart, to stay a step ahead of the tracers. But it turns out that, now there's a whole industry of these companies. They are in this kind of cat and mouse game. The cats are like extremely well funded and competitive with each other to find new ways to defeat those anonymity techniques. And also the cats, it turns out, travel back in time, because the blockchain is there forever. If you made a mistake a decade ago, even what wasn't considered a mistake a decade ago, but now with our, retrospective ability to use like the latest techniques to look at the blockchain, that's still recorded there for Chainalysis or one of its competitors or law enforcement to go dig up years and years later. So, all of that gives this incredible advantage to essentially crypto surveillance that, probably should have been obvious when I first started looking at Bitcoin, but it wasn't, it wasn't intuitive. It just turns out to be true and very powerful.
So, we've been talking about Bitcoin, and you mentioned other privacy coins like Zcash or for us Canadians, Zcash or Monero. Is it safe to assume that even if we think they're untraceable now, that they'll be traceable at some point in the future?
Well, I get in a lot of trouble with Monero people because I point to some evidence that Monero is already not as untraceable as Monero users would like to think it is. Monero is certainly the most adopted of these privacy coins. Now that we know that Bitcoin is the opposite of a privacy coin, I think, a lot of people have moved to Monero looking for privacy and it's very sophisticated. It is certainly not easily traced. It is like the other side of the spectrum, or almost, from Bitcoin. But I've seen in a leaked Chainalysis document that they claim to be able to give a usable lead to law enforcement the majority of the time, something like 60% of the time, when they're faced with the Monero transaction that they're, in a case. I don't know exactly how they do it, but they essentially, all they really said in that slide, which was in Italian, it was being presented to the Italian police before it was leaked, is, that they can, with some probability, identify the sender and sometimes the recipient, but not necessarily the same kind of, deterministic certainty that they have with Bitcoin. That's still probably, that should not be very reassuring to Monero users. If we look at like the Bitfinex case, this really high profile case where this New York couple, you probably remember, the Crocodile of Wall Street was like the nickname for it. The woman in this couple, that they essentially stole and laundered $4.5 billion. And that money was traced to them. And at one point, they moved it into Monero. And yet you can see in the IRS's like criminal complaint document, affidavit, essentially, that they could continue to follow the money. And they don't say how they did that. But, I know that IRS criminal investigations works incredibly closely with Chainalysis. They are essentially the main characters of my book. And their partnership is what made the whole thing possible. So I don't know. I think you have to assume that there is an inability to trace Monero out there. And we don't know exactly how powerful it is, but I think it has been used, certainly. Now, Zcash, I think, is a different story. And this, Monero people don't like me saying this either, but I actually think that Zcash is, if there is such a thing as an untraceable digital currency, it probably is Zcash. And I'm not sure that there is another one that you can say that of, because Zcash uses this much more newfangled kind of cryptography called zero knowledge proofs, where they can essentially truly encrypt the entire blockchain and yet still extract proofs from it, so that you can, without learning, with zero knowledge of who was behind the transaction, you can prove that it took place and essentially authenticate. You can confirm a transaction without knowing the amount of it, without knowing who the sender or recipient is. Essentially, all of the things that the Bitcoin blockchain does that make Bitcoin possible, but without all of the disastrous privacy implications. So essentially, Zcash is the privacy preserving cryptocurrency that Bitcoin was once believed to be, I would say. Now, only a small fraction of Zcash users actually even turn on the privacy feature, what's called shielded transactions. So I think a lot more people would have to use it for it to be truly as private as it is technically capable of being. And I don't see that much adoption of Zcash anyway, but I think the potential is there. And if, for instance, ransomware operators, I don't want to give them hints here, but like if they were to adopt Zcash, I think it would take away a major tool in the investigative tool belt of people like, all of us, the three of us.
Do we have any sense of what percentage of crypto transactions are linked to cybercrime? Is it the majority, the minority?
Oh, I think you caught me out. I don't know what the number is, but I know that it's a tiny minority. That is, Chainalysis, basically the trend that Chainalysis, is always documenting in their annual crime reports, if I'm up to speed on this, it certainly has been for several years, that the amount of crypto crime is growing over time in a kind of absolute sense. But as a proportion of the cryptocurrency economy as a whole, it's a smaller percentage of crypto than ever before because crypto is growing in its adoption, very quickly. And that's something that, a lot of crypto people want to point out to me all the time. Like, Andy, why are you so focused on crypto crime? That's like, a decade old. That's old crypto. We are in this kind of new, I would say, somewhat boring crypto world where this stuff is used legally for legitimate investments or a store of value or something. I don't really know what the actual purpose of Bitcoin is. I don't mean to I'm kind of agnostic on it. But to me, the fact that this criminal crypto just, sitting, I don't really care about crypto as a whole. The fact that criminal use of cryptocurrency, not as a proportion of crypto, but in an absolute sense, is still growing over time. That, North Korean hackers stole $1 billion of cryptocurrency last year. That ransomware actors extracted $1 billion of ransomware fees last year in cryptocurrency. That, to me, that is a story in itself that is extremely important and relevant as a crime story, as like a story about bad actors in the world and their ability to use this tool.
So as you've just described, cryptocurrency has definitely made life easier for ransomware operators and other cyber criminals. Is there a way that we can realistically stop it, or at least make the crypto ecosystem less easy to use for criminal purposes?
Right. Well, I feel like I turn to you all. Usually Brett is the one that I call to ask these questions. Like, how do you stop ransomware? That is, if I knew, the world would be a better place. But, I guess it is kind of in one of the later sections of the book, I turn to this question of ransomware. Like, if cryptocurrency is so traceable and it has led to all of these almost miraculous cyber criminal busts and takedowns, how is it that ransomware still uses it and it's just flourishing to this degree? And the answer is pretty simple, sadly. It's just that, yes, you can trace all of this. You can identify with remarkable clarity who ransomware actors are. Chain analysis knows how, as I was saying, they even pay their affiliates, the commissions that they take. They can see the entire ransomware economy laid out in some sense, but that doesn't let you lay hands on them. They are mostly in Russia, it seems, or sometimes other, non-extradition countries. And visibility is not arrestability. I'm not the best word for it, but the fact that you can follow the money doesn't mean that you can take it back necessarily. It doesn't mean that you can stop the people carrying out the crime. It is true that visibility is important, and I do think that there is a big role for cryptocurrency tracing and cryptocurrency regulation to play in trying to essentially, attack ransomware's, its purse strings. If you can prevent ransomware actors from easily cashing out the profits of their ransoms in cryptocurrency, then you've made their lives much harder. And it does seem like US regulators in particular have really been trying to crack down on mixing services, on rogue exchanges. They've sanctioned ransomware actors to, in part, make it harder for them to move their money around. And if you can create that kind of liquidity problem for them, then maybe you'll never be able to stop criminal behavior or cybercrime, especially when you can't actually create any consequences for these people in terms of actually being arrested and going to jail. But if you can make this expensive enough, then perhaps you can get them to switch to some other form of crime that's less disruptive. I mean, ransomware, sadly, is it's very profitable, but its profit is actually just pales in comparison to the damage it does to society. So if we could just get hackers, cyber criminals to go back to less damaging forms of cybercrime that don't happen to involve cryptocurrency by, cutting off these off-ramps, essentially, where they trade their cryptocurrency for fiat, whether that's, dollars or rubles or whatever, then perhaps we can just find, that could be one choke point to attack ransomware.
Do you have any insights into how they do actually cash out? We're not talking about hundreds or even hundreds of thousands of dollars here. We're talking about, as you said, north of $1 billion per year. How do they convert that into usable cash?
Well, it does seem that there are rogue exchanges in Russia, like, let's see, Chadex, Suex, Garantex. I forget the state of each one. They've been sanctioned. In some cases, they have been shut down. It seems like sanctioning an exchange does make their life really difficult. It makes them very hard for them to interface with the traditional financial world. But I think if I have this right, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but the Garantex is still functioning. And it only takes one working exchange where ransomware actors can take their extracted Bitcoins and trade them for rubles, and they can go buy that Lamborghini or whatever. And then there are also, of course, there's a whole ecosystem of mixing services, which I don't think that they necessarily can make crypto as untraceable as their users believe, but they can certainly make it harder to keep up with the money and try to seize it or freeze it, to recover it, to kind of keep track of it as sanctions, fruits of crime, and prevent it from being cashed out. So, tools like Tornado Cash, I've seen, I think you probably, Brett and Luke, you probably know at least as much as I do about the cutting edge of like where ransomware actors are laundering their cryptocurrency, but it's constantly changing. I mean, I've seen the evolution myself, that it used to be like chip mixer, then it became Sinbad, and now it's somehow back to Tornado Cash, despite the fact that Tornado Cash has been sanctioned. And it seems like this is a kind of cat and mouse game that will continue, and it really only takes, in this case, it does kind of seem like the mice do have an advantage, because it just takes some mixer, some rogue exchange to exist out there, and you've created one escape route for this cryptocurrency to reach the fiat economy, which is really all the criminals need. So I'm still hopeful. I still feel like it's part of the toolkit, that like if you crack down on enough of these, then you can create you can make it expensive. You can, if there's only one off ramp left, then maybe it charges a huge premium for the risk of doing all these criminal transactions, and that reduces the profit of the ransomware actors. So maybe someday we will be able to shut down every exchange that is just flagrantly doing these deals, and force ransomware actors to do something more creative or something less profitable, something that costs more, with all of the profits that they're extracting from their victims. And that would be a huge win. I think it's, I really have learned this from you, Brett, that's like part of what has to be a kind of like, collective approach of putting the squeeze on these guys. You have to do it from every direction. It has to, and yes, following the money, tightening the screws on the financial world is just like one aspect, but you have to kind of, I think, like pin them down from every direction. And that includes, I shouldn't be telling you, but like increasing the defenses of victims, encouraging them not to pay ransoms, increasing the resilience of victims so that they don't feel the need to pay ransoms if they can recover in some other way. And probably like a whole, suite of solutions. But yeah, the financial one is, I think, really important. And it's luckily, the bizarre thing about cryptocurrency is that it is very helpful for the criminals, that it's kind of unstoppable, uncensorable. The money can't be prevented from moving beyond borders. That part of it is very good for them, but it is extremely traceable. And that's this weird property of ransomware, like that, I think I quoted you in this story, Brett. I was able to see when the Change Healthcare ransomware actors, Alpha, I think is how you pronounce that, although there's a V at the end of the name, that we could see when they received the $22 million payment on the blockchain. And that is like a weird thing. Like, what other kind of ransom is done, not in some back alley, but in full public view? And that, it is actually a huge gift to investigators.
In some cases, law enforcement have actually been able to recover the ransom there, to recover the Bitcoin off the blockchain. Do we have any idea as to the mechanics by which that happens? And if it happens in some cases, why can't it happen in more?
I ask myself, of course, I think you're speaking really specifically of the Colonial Pipeline case. Maybe I don't know, at least at some points, it was the highest profile ransomware case in history. And in that case, the FBI was able to, with Chainalysis' help, they eventually admitted publicly, or took credit for it, follow the money and find it on some server somewhere. We don't know where exactly, and seize back like the majority of it. Probably like a portion of it had already been paid to an affiliate or something like that. I'm not really sure. And the FBI and Chainalysis have never said how they did that. The Chainalysis essentially said, yes, we followed the money. The FBI, I believe all that they have really said, or the Justice Department have said, we were able to obtain the private keys to take this money back, which is like, yeah, that's how you move cryptocurrency. That's not a very helpful explanation. But it seems like I can imagine a bunch of ways it could happen. Like maybe somehow this was early enough in the cryptocurrency cat and mouse game that I believe it was dark side, what they were called at the time, although they are essentially just have been reincarnated several times and now are alpha. Maybe they were foolish enough back then to keep the money in some kind of like a crypto exchange that could be reached by US law enforcement. Hard to imagine they kept it like on US soil somehow. Or, the FBI has been known, like they're more restricted in this than intelligence agencies or other hackers, but they have been known to sometimes do real hackback operations. And maybe they somehow secretly, they haven't said this publicly, they got legal clearance, they got the warrant or whatever necessary to actually go hack into whatever computer in Russia contained those private keys and steal the money back. But that raises the question, as you're saying, I think, of like, well, why haven't we ever seen that since? There's certainly been even more high profile, much larger ransom payments, and they are almost never recovered, as far as I can tell. So, I guess that if the FBI had that authority or was able to finagle it in that case, I think we would have seen it happen more times, and it hasn't. So instead, I feel like it seems more like it was probably some operational security slip up by DarkSide, and they have learned their lesson because we haven't seen it since.
Andy, before you wrote Tracers in the Dark, you wrote a book called Sandworm, and I've got it here. I don't know if we can focus on it. Sandworm, A New Era in Cyberwar and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. Can you tell us what the book's about? What is Sandworm? Where did the term come from?
Right. Well, speaking of Russian hackers, Sandworm is essentially not a cyber criminal or ransomware Russian hacker group, but actual state-sponsored practitioners of cyber warfare rather. They, starting in 2014, carried out really the most aggressive, most consequential cyber attacks in history, from causing blackouts in Ukraine now 3 times, twice that are documented in the book. They've, of course, continued since the book came out. They released the NotPetya malware that spread from Ukraine to the rest of the world and did $10 billion in damage through its vast ripple effects across the global economy, shutting down Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm, Mondelez, which owns Cadbury and Nabisco, Merck, they had to stop its manufacture of pharmaceuticals, and on and on and on. Truly I would say still the kind of closest thing to a cyber Armageddon we've ever seen, if that's not too hyperbolic a word. And then, Sandworm continued on. They shut down, they destroyed essentially the back end of the 2018 Olympics in the midst of the opening ceremony and left the poor IT administrators of the Pyeongchang Olympics to rebuild their network in real time to try to keep the Olympics alive. They have, since they did another blackout, as I said, in Ukraine, and this time in the midst of an air raid of missile strikes, they are responsible for the destruction of a Ukrainian telecom just in recent months, destroying essentially their entire network. I mean, they are the quintessential cyber war group, and the book is really about it's kind of the detective story of tracing Sandworm's decade of destruction, although it wasn't quite that much back then. It was more like half a decade from the first glimmers of this group and this small group of detectives who kind of saw that there was this mysterious group out there doing these things, to trying to pin it on Russia, to trying to understand what they were doing and why, and then ultimately trying to identify them. I mean, the book ends with this theory that Sandworm is this one unit of Russia's GRU military intelligence agency, Unit 74455 of the GRU. And that turned out to be correct. That was proven or kind of confirmed in the year after the book came out. And now there is a $10 million bounty on this group of GRU hackers from the US State Department. And we continue to see them active. The book came out in 2019, years, in fact, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now I think the world has kind of really come to see, Russia's aggression, but also this cyber war has continued. And it's not, I think, as visible in the midst of a tragic and catastrophic physical war that has displaced millions of people from Ukraine and, killed many, many thousands and destroyed enormous amounts of Ukraine's infrastructure. But it's happening nonetheless. And it is, I think if it were happening anywhere else in the world, it would be seen to be the biggest cyber war in history, just the last 2 years of Russia's cyber attacks there. And Sandworm has continued to be an enormous part of that. But sorry, you asked about the story of the book, which ends in 2019. But yes, that's really, I'm telling you the story of Sandworm, which continues today. Those hackers are still out there wreaking havoc.
Is it only Ukraine the Sandworm is currently targeting, or do they operate internationally?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the book began when I wrote this cover story for Wired about this notion that Ukraine was Russia's test lab for cyber war. And that was I started looking at that in 2016 and went to Ukraine for the first time in early 2017. And certainly Sandworm and Russia's hackers as a whole are incredibly focused on Ukraine. I mean, Russia has been obsessed with Ukraine and bullying Ukraine and testing out new forms of physical and digital attack in Ukraine for at least a decade. I mean, really, Russia's relationship with Ukraine stretches back like a millennia. And I try to tell that story even in the book as quickly as I can fit into, a few chapters. But no, Sandworm is really Russia's most, I don't know, their main cyber attack tool, their group that they use for cyber physical destructive consequences hacking operation. And they've used that abroad as well. I mean, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. NotPetya was an example where they released a worm in Ukraine, perhaps with the intention of just carpet bombing the Ukrainian internet, but worms don't respect national boundaries. And I think that Sandworm was probably aware of that. And some people actually theorize that NotPetya was meant to be a kind of cyber embargo, that, it's like a trade embargo by cyber attack means, that it was meant to punish everybody doing business in Ukraine. It was actually spread through this supply chain attack that compromised MEDOC and a piece of Ukrainian accounting software. So basically any multinational doing business in Ukraine had that software installed somewhere on their network. And that was enough for them to get infected, which is why companies like Merck and Maersk and Mondelez and many, many others, FedEx, were so devastated by NotPetya. And that probably wasn't entirely an accident, But then there have also just been straight up, targeting of non-Ukrainian victims, including, as I said, the Pyeongchang Olympics, which was really just this, a similar, obsession of Russia's is the Olympics and the doping allegations that they hate to hear about, and the fact that they had been banned actually from those Olympics. And so it's just a kind of petty grievance that that led them to try to, if we can't enjoy the Olympics, nobody will. And they also even tried to pin that attack on they use these kind of layers of false flags to make it look at times Chinese, at times North Korean. But ultimately it was Sandworm, of course, that did that. But that had nothing to do with Ukraine, really. And was just Sandworm being used in another venue altogether. We've seen Sandworm attack Georgia, the country of Georgia. And in fact, it was this pretty minor, by comparison, cyber attack in Georgia in 2020 after the book came out, where the US State Department and others finally said this group is that did this attack is Sandworm, and it is in fact this one unit of the GRU. That was the first time that Sandworm was actually publicly confirmed, and it was important because it was although it was not Ukraine, that was a non-NATO, non-EU country. And nonetheless, the US was calling this out and saying this is not acceptable. Russia should not be doing these kind of destructive cyber attacks on any civilians, anyone, period, that's not in a state of war with them, which they were not. The Ukraine war had not even started at that point. I mean, only the limited invasion of the east of Ukraine and the seizing of Crimea. So the idea of the book really was, this kind of theme throughout was that the US had really failed at a policy level to try to set this rule, to make clear to Russia that this was unacceptable. That, we in the West had just watched Russia bully Ukraine in many ways for decades, but then particularly with cyber war for these years. And even when they crossed the line and turned out the lights, called blackouts, released NotPetya, it took us so long to realize, we need to say that this is not acceptable. And I think it's in some ways a parable for what would happen in Ukraine ultimately, which is that, we did not demonstrate to Putin enough that Ukraine is not his sphere of influence, that we care about Ukrainians and we would come to their defense. And it took us, sadly, until 2022, I think, to make that full shift.
Okay. Sure, the Sandworm and Russia didn't appreciate you looking into their activities. Were there any potential personal consequences?
Definitely potential. I was really scared. And more so now, I look back on, I went to Russia for this book, I went to Ukraine several times and ultimately went to Russia too. And went to, St. Petersburg to attend a hacking conference and then Moscow to, get as close as I could to, I literally went to the building where Unit 74455 operates from, where Sandworm is located, just to, really to just see it for myself. I didn't have any illusion that I was going to get an interview with them or something. And that was quite harrowing, just in the sense that it's not fun to travel with burner phones and burner laptops. I don't know how you all do your business travel, but it's a very lonely and paranoid experience. And ultimately, though, nothing happened, which was almost even more frustrating. Maybe they were watching me from a distance, but I didn't even, get arrested and get a good chapter for the book out of it or anything. So it was ultimately very frustrating. But I look back on it now and I see what's happened with Evan Gershkovich, the reporter for the Wall Street Journal, has been detained in Russia for more than a year. And I realized that I was lucky. And I just hope that he can come home. I feel like this is a new era where I would not myself dare to travel to Russia. Things have gotten so much worse in terms of our relationship with Russia and the total sense of impunity that the Russian government feels like it has. So things were slightly different in 2019 and 2018 when I went to Russia, and it was nonetheless still a bit scary. And I certainly worried all the time that Sandworm would come after me. But I don't know. I ask myself sometimes, did they kind of like the attention that I was giving to them? Were they just waiting for somebody to notice how incredibly, aggressive and unprecedented and dangerous they were? And are they kind of proud to have their name on a book out there? I hope not, in a sense. I feel like it's important to raise awareness of them and to call for consequences against them, by telling their story. But they may also have kind of liked it, I'm hopeful that they don't like it as much now that I'm, essentially writing pieces about the argument that they should face charges at The Hague for cyber war crimes. And I'm still, I don't know, I should be more objective in this, but I'm still hopeful that will happen at some point. I feel like it's absolutely justified. And maybe if that ever does happen, then they will feel differently about the spotlight I put on them.
Do the cyber attacks in Ukraine represent a canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world? And what do they tell us about our own vulnerabilities? Like, has Sandworm been active in the US and elsewhere, for example?
Yeah, as I said, when I first wrote about Sandworm, it was in this feature for Wired about really those first two blackout attacks that hit Ukraine. And I had also observed, I mean, I think a lot of people had, that Russia had hacked the Ukrainian election in 2014. They tried to spoof the results of their presidential election in 2014. And then they'd hacked the US election in some sense in 2016, not trying to spoof results or messing with the actual vote count or anything, but by hacking and leaking emails to sabotage the campaign of Hillary Clinton. And it seemed to me like there was this kind of like, I don't know, what is the word for this? The syllogism or something? Like they hacked their elections, then they hack ours, they hack their power grid, what's to follow. It seemed like they had this toolkit that they could use against us too. And that, but in a broader sense, I was trying to warn in that piece that like Russia is developing, it is kind of unleashing cyber war in Ukraine in a way that we should not consider to be just Ukraine's problem. That would be really foolish. And that sooner or later, like this beast, like this Pandora's box, now that it's open, will spread to the rest of the world. And in fact, bizarrely, the week that feature came out in Wired, that issue of the magazine was arriving at people's doorsteps or whatever, was the week that NotPetya hits and literally hit Ukraine and spread to the rest of the world. And I think that on that level alone, like it demonstrated that we are interconnected in ways that are not intuitive, that, like the internet has rewritten the rules of warfare just in the sense of its geography, that we can't create like a cyber war that's happening in Ukraine as their problem when we are connected to Ukraine. And that's like not it wasn't like felt in a, small, trivial way. Like the lesson was gigantic. I mean, we're talking about the world's largest shipping firm shutting down, and like container ships the size of the Empire State Building with another Empire State Building's like worth of cargo on top of it, like horizontally, I should say, drifting like over oceans and nobody knows what is on them, and arriving at ports and like nobody knows how to unload them because the IT systems for these terminals and ports around the world have been wiped by NotPetya. And like trucks are lining up outside of these ports, unable to get in because the voice over IP system that they use to check in to know what to pick up or drop off has been destroyed by NotPetya. Like trucks in lines miles long outside these ports at 17 terminals in ports around the world. And that is just Maersk. Then you look at Merck, who had to borrow their own HPV vaccine from the Center for Disease Control because their manufacturer of drugs had been completely shut down. And then, like NotPetya destroyed this speech-to-text transcription software company called Nuance, decimated their network. Then turned out that speech-to-text transcription was used in dozens of hospitals across the United States for reading changes into medical records. Those changes were completely lost. As a result, they were in these raw audio files, untranscribed. And so patients' medical records were not updated. Patients who were, children due for surgery in a matter of hours. And IT administrators are hunting through these raw audio files to try to find whether they've had the tests that they need to go have surgery or to be transferred to another hospital. I mean, the ripple effects of NotPetya are, I think even today, even after like one catastrophic ransomware attack after another, they are, I would say, still the most egregious we've ever seen. And certainly from a single attack. I mean, one attack that did all of this around the world. And yes, that happened in the West, that happened in the United States. So Sandworm absolutely did already hit the United States in a big way. But I guess that in a more literal and targeted sense, there is always the possibility that like, if Russia, I did actually think that, I think many people thought that when the US imposed sanctions on Russia in the way that it did in 2022, that they would lash out and try to retaliate for that, or like put pressure on the West by carrying out destructive cyber attacks. Instead, I feel like Russia as a whole, and Sandworm specifically, have been very much completely distracted and hijacked in their attention by the war in Ukraine. In fact, you see some signs that Russia's hackers are kind of struggling to keep up with the pace of the war in Ukraine. They're not like crafting these year-long operations where they plant the perfect, intricate, beautifully crafted piece of malware inside a network. They're just running and gunning and writing the simplest, destructive whiteboard they can and implementing it as quickly as possible and moving on to the next one, because the pace of a war is much faster than than a kind of pure cyber war. So no, I don't think we've seen, as I guess that in this literal sense, we had not seen Sandworm turn its gaze, towards the West, towards the US and its targeting. But I think in a broader sense, they are demonstrating what's possible with cyber war. And not only is it a matter of time until that hits us, but it in fact has already hit us. And we saw that with NotPetya in the most dramatic form possible.
Finally, a question we ask everyone. Ransomware has been getting worse for years. The profits have been going up and up. Nothing we have done so far has put any sort of significant dent in us. Has the time come just to ban ransom payments? Is that the solution?
This is absolutely the question that I would ask you and with my reporter hat on. So this is your area so much more than mine. And I'm lucky as a reporter that I get to cover these things from a certain remove and not have to give people advice or make these decisions. I do think that, I guess, I don't want to cop out from this question entirely. So I would say no, a ransomware ban is probably not the right approach, because I feel like it will. I've heard Patrick Gray on the Risky Business podcast make this argument that if there were a ransomware ban, then maybe ransomware actors would just start hammering victims in the country with the ban, to just try to basically break the ban, because they would want to demonstrate, look, if you ban ransomware, it will become even more painful for you. Paying the ransom is the path of least resistance, and you need to preserve that for your victims, or we will just, hammer the, I was going to use an expletive out of them. And I do worry that might happen. Certainly, I think that would be one thing that would happen initially if there were to be suddenly a universal ransomware ban. They would try to demonstrate that you should not have done that, and now we're going to teach you a lesson. You're going to wish you could pay the ransom. Don't you think that they do have a kind of retaliatory, adversarial mindset? They don't slink away when you make life harder for them immediately. So that's one concern. I do think that there needs to be a disincentive at the same time for companies to pay the ransom. I believe that Change Healthcare probably paid the ransom, right? We can see that the attackers who hit them got a $22 million payment very conveniently timed. So it's almost, it's almost a foregone conclusion that they paid that ransom. And in their 8K filing or whatever it is, they don't even have to say that. It's so immaterial to them that they paid this money. And yet the damage done by that attack is certainly material to patients. And the fact that the ransomware actors who pulled it off profited from it and were incentivized to do it again, that's incredibly, damaging to society. So there needs to be some kind of changing of the economic scales to disincentivize victims from paying. But I don't know how that looks, because I haven't thought hard enough about this, because I do think that a ban is just a very large and simple and kind of indiscreet solution that might, exacerbate the problem, certainly deprives companies of one solution to the problem. But I don't know. It's we can't continue in the way that we are either, just where all the incentives are aligned for the actors themselves. So it has to be something in between. And I don't know what the shape of that is. Hopefully you all, as the real pros, have some sense.
And as we wrap up this episode, I highly recommend Andy's books, Sandworm and Tracers in the Dark. They both provide very engaging descriptions of the sorts of criminal cyber activity taking place and the real life impacts on individuals. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Andy, for taking the time to join us here today. And as always, we thank our listeners for tuning in. To stay up to date on the latest in cybersecurity, be sure to subscribe to our podcast.